Welcome to the Family Answer Man program. Today, we are answering your questions about jealousy and grief from a biblical worldview on the Family Answer Man. This is David Orgis, and I am here with Dr. Mark Crosby, the Family Answer Man. This time is designed to answer questions commonly asked both in the counseling and church setting. Our goal is to answer general questions from a biblical worldview through the lens of our collective years of experience and education to help you have a stronger, healthier, and happier family. Now, we want to say thank you to the incredible people at Winter's Air and Days Smokehouse and Specialty Meats for underwriting today's show. Winter's Air is located in Denham Springs and services the Denham Springs and surrounding areas. And Days Meat Market is located at 35770 at LA Highway 16 in Denham Springs. This is not a therapy session, nor is this advice specific to your situation. Mental health is a very serious issue, and family dynamics can and often are complicated and dynamic. For more in-depth answers to your questions, we encourage you to seek professional counsel for your specific circumstances. We hope that this episode of Family Answer Man will encourage you and inspire you to make changes that will lead to a stronger, healthier, and happier family. I'm David Orgis, and I have a master's in professional counseling, 18 years in ministry, an ordination in the Southern Baptist Church, and I've been married for 11 years now to a wonderful woman, and we have 4 kids. Dr. Mark has his PhD in psychology, his master's in clinical counseling, his master's in pastoral counseling and theology. He has a master's in law with a focus in mediation, and he is a licensed professional counselor, a licensed professional counselor supervisor, and a licensed marriage and family therapist. Dr. Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit today about your area of emphasis in your practice?
Yeah, I love to work with families, love to work with couples. What I've discovered over the years is that, marriage, and I've been married for 40 years, marriage is one of the most wonderful relationships you'll ever have. However, it is the most complex. I mean, you have 2 people who come from 2 different types of family systems who are now coming together as one. And what begins to happen is each will have their own preference, their own perspective, their own perception of things. Each one will have their own idea. Each one were raised in a different way, and so now their worldview or their understanding of relationships is going to be different, and now they are merged together, and sometimes that causes some friction, sometimes that causes some dissonance, sometimes that causes, various, situations and circumstances whereby they're not quite sure how to work through it, how to deal with it, and what begins to happen is they let the sun go down on their anger, and that anger and that frustration begins to pile up and get worse and becomes more complex. And before they know it, they are at odds. And before they know it, they see each other as, unfortunately, the enemy. And perhaps while they're doing that, they're punishing one another, being critical of one another, being disrespectful of one another, etc. And now what was supposed to be this amazing, wonderful relationship is now starting to break down. And if you don't know how to manage that, if you don't know how to solve that, if you don't know how to resolve that, then things go from bad to worse. Therefore, I will argue that marriage counseling, marriage therapy is simply helping a couple to have the tools, to have the skills, to have the knowledge they need to work through and overcome some of the problems that so many go through. And that's where marriage and family therapy comes in. It's simply coaching. It's simply helping. Here's what I tell couples all the time, because when they first come in, they're a little embarrassed about being there, some of them. And I ask them, I said, what does Drew Brees and Tiger Woods and Joe Burrow all have in common? And they'll look at me and they go, well, they're all athletes. I go, yeah, that's true. And they're all great athletes. Yeah, that's true. But they all have coaches. They all have coaches. They're all skilled. They're all great athletes. They're all top of their game. They all have coaches. And so here we are in this dynamic called marriage, and if we're not sure what to do, if we don't have coaches, then we're going to struggle. And so family therapy basically is coaching a couple to work through some of the problems and get better in life and to make life better.
Well, that's a great analogy, and I'm glad you brought that analogy up of being a coach and how we all need coaches, because with this program, we are in a unique position where everyone that's listening to this show gets to view you a little bit as their coach. And if there is a coach that is credentialed and knows it is you. And so we are blessed on the Family Answer Man to have you as our coach, as our expert, to give us that guidance that we need when we need it. So our first question today, because Family Answer Man is a program that's designed to be a Q&A. And so if anyone is listening and they want to email in some questions, let everyone know that you can email familyanswerman@loumc.org, or you can email soundradioinfo@milldale.org to send those questions in. And we've gotten questions. We had questions before the show. You've had years of questions that you've been asked, and we're already receiving some of those questions that people have from just the first week show that we had, which was, by all accounts, very helpful to a lot of people. So the first question we have today on Family Answer Man is, someone wrote in, said, I work in a predominantly male industry, and as a result, I have lots of male friends. Now, my husband constantly shares his disapproval of my relationships and comes across as, quote, the jealous guy. He doesn't like it when I tell him that he can trust me. What does the Bible say about this?
Wow, yeah, that's a very common scenario where you have, especially in today's world, where you have maybe a wife in a predominantly male setting as far as their employment and vocation. And because of that, you're going to have a lot of interaction, naturally with your coworkers. And sometimes, your coworkers become your friends. And sometimes, these friends want to do things and share things, beyond the office or the workplace. However, with that being said, there needs to be, again, some boundaries set up. And so being that the question is, what does the Bible say about this? We'll begin with that. The Bible says that we're called to leave and cleave. And what it means is, in Genesis, that the Word of God says you're to leave your father and your mother to cleave to your spouse or cleave to your wife. And why that's so important is because leaving and cleaving simply is that principle that says, I want my marriage to have marital purity. In other words, I don't want anything getting in my marriage, anyone, any person, any family of origin situation that's going to interfere with being the right person, the right spouse, the right husband, the right wife. In other words, marital purity is extremely important. So, in other words, don't allow anything to get between you and your spouse. A family member, a friend, a coworker, nothing comes between you and your spouse. That is primary, and that is the priority, if you will, or the purity, if you will, of every marital relationship. And so, in other words, here's the bottom line. Our loyalty is to be to our spouse. Yeah, we have coworkers that we work with. Yeah, we have friends, we have neighbors, we have people we went to school with or whatever that we're still close to. I get it. But once you're married, your loyalty is to your spouse. Now, what I tell couples all the time is that one way of making that happen is, I think it's important for a couple to talk about this and say, okay, so what are our guardrails? In other words, a guardrail is letting you know when you're driving down a very steep, hill, be careful, slow down, because if you go too fast on the other side of this guardrail, there's danger. And so we need to have guardrails, I believe, in our marriage. And some of those guardrails, maybe a couple will agree to say, you know what, I'm not going to have lunch with anybody of the opposite sex, just the two of us, because, again, that could be a problem. That could lead to something. That could, lead to a situation. Some will say, not only will I not do that, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking personally, texting personally information to someone of the opposite gender, whether it be social media, etc. Some will say, I'm not going to have or spend time having coffee with someone of the opposite gender, just the two of us. Now, whenever I say that, someone will say, it's just lunch. It's just a cup of coffee. I mean, come on, we're traveling across town, and just you and this other person, but we're saving gas. I mean, gas is so expensive now, and we're saving parking. What's the big deal? And I will own the fact that maybe it's not a big deal, but it is a guardrail. Because the reality is, that is when things begin to happen. That lunch date, that cup of coffee, that talking and sharing, intimate situations and information on social media, it begins to create, if you're not careful, a dynamic that can lead to something that you thought would never happen. The Bible says this. The Bible says, don't give the devil an opportunity. And so these guardrails, I will argue, helps to ensure that reality, that I'm not going to give the devil an opportunity for someone to say something or to see something or to think something that, again, is not legitimate. And so, again, having guardrails, having boundaries, knowing the dangers is important. Most of our listening audience is pretty well versed in most of the Old Testament characters such as David and Solomon and Samson. King David, the Bible says, was a man after God's own heart. But King David looked a second time at the woman Bathsheba. He was not where he was supposed to be. And he got involved, and his entire life and his entire kingdom unraveled. Solomon, considered perhaps the wisest man of the Old Testament, he struggled with relationships. He had, I believe, 300 wives and 700 concubines. Most would argue that was perhaps not the wisest choice he could ever make. Samson, the strongest man of the Bible, gets caught up with a woman named Delilah, loses his eyesight, and goes from being one of these great men of God to now, grinding wheat, like a farm animal. The point is this: you cannot be too careful in today's world. Keep guardrails, recognize the dangers, and make sure your spouse is the one to whom you're loyal.
So I remember when I was younger, my parents took us on a lot of road trips, and being in some of the national parks, some of the roads had guardrails and some didn't. Right. Which those were terrifying. I remember my dad driving at night and there not being guardrails and just being a little terrified, wanted to sit in the middle seat and not at the window.
Correct.
Tell me, what's the difference between a guardrail and a kennel? Because I think that's something that people have a hard time distinguishing of what the difference of a guardrail is and how it maybe what is the purpose of a guardrail? Because some people will say it's super restrictive.
Right.
It's gonna lock me in.
Right.
We have these unbreakable rules that
Yeah, again, a guardrail, in the sense of transportation, if you will, the highways and byways and hills and so forth, basically is letting you know there is danger on the other side. In other words, if you go past this guardrail, on the other side, there is danger, and it could be danger that is beyond our comprehension. Slow down, stay on this side, don't get too close to the edge. And that's what these marital guardrails are designed to do as well. They're telling the couple, you know what, I am not going to get on social media and talk, about personal things to someone of the opposite gender. I'm just not going to do that, because if I stay on this side of that guardrail, I know I'm safe. But how many times have I counseled someone? How many times have I worked with a couple where they got closer to the edge and closer to the edge and closer to the edge, and before they knew it, they were on the other side of the guardrail. Before they knew it, they were seeing this person in a more private setting. Before they knew it, it went from just some real, quote unquote, innocent flirtation to now they're holding hands, to now they're getting involved on a physical level. These things, again, happen when we do not recognize the power of, again, the tension between men and women in many cases. And so these guardrails protect you. These guardrails are this rule that you have so that not only you will be protected, but so that your spouse will have confidence in that, hey, I know my wife or I know my husband is not going to be passing this guardrail. We've talked about this, and so I am confident that he or she is not going to cross certain lines or certain boundaries. And so, when we get married, the reality is that it's not about me. I want to do everything that I can to make sure that my wife, in my case, is confident and is confident in the fact that who we are and what we do and what we have is not going to be jeopardized or compromised.
You've talked about it before that in marriage, we don't punish our spouse. And
Correct.
so what I'm hearing you say is that guardrails are more protection rather than punishment. They're not there to keep restrictions on us so that we can enjoy life, have fun, connect with other people that we work with, but they're there to protect the sanctity of our marriage relationships.
And unfortunately, I hate to say it like this, but unfortunately, there are people, in various settings that sometimes will take advantage of a person's friendliness, or may take someone's, shall we say, friendly flirtation further than it was ever intended. And so the point I'm making is that we have to be careful, because affair proofing our marriages is crucial. whenever I'm working with a couple who is preparing for marriage, I'll ask them, so what is the one thing that would end this marriage? And then we're talking somewhat hypothetically as we're preparing them for marriage, but they pause and they look at me and they look at each other. And oftentimes they'll say the one thing that would probably end this marriage is if he or she got involved with someone else in an affair. And, even Jesus alluded to this, in Matthew when he was asked, what are the conditions for divorce? And he talks about adultery. And so affair-proofing our marriage is so important and so powerful. And the reality is it could happen at any time. In other words, especially if you work with lots of women and you're a guy, work with lots of men and you're a female, the reality is that temptation is going to be higher and greater in most of these cases if you're not careful. It's just a reality of how we live and the culture we live in.
One of the parts of the question that was asked said he doesn't like it when I tell him that he can trust me. So how do guardrails create trust?
Well, guardrails create trust because you've talked about it. I mean, so many times there's so many areas of our marriage where we do not talk about some of these things, that are important to us in marriage. I mean, we talk about the weather, we talk about the kids, we talk about what's for dinner, we talk about, what we're going to watch on TV, and those are all great things, and those are fine subjects. But sometimes we don't talk about the things that concern us or frighten us. Sometimes we don't talk about the things that we are maybe insecure about. And we're called to do that. And I will say that is true intimacy. When you can talk about those things that you are fearful of, those things that you are insecure about, those things that make you feel uncomfortable, and you can say it and talk about it without pushback from your spouse, with a hope of understanding, with a hope of feeling a greater connection and attachment. But we don't do that in many of our marriages. And so what happens is that when you have this discussion and you talk about the guardrails and you talk about the things that make you feel insecure, that creates, I would hope, a greater attachment, a greater intimacy. And now everybody kind of knows what is important and why these guardrails are important and why we want to keep them in our life to affair-proof our marriage.
That's good insight. That's really good insight. So Family Answer Man is a Q&A with questions that are going to come in. And so our second question that we have for today for the Family Answer Man is this. It's a little shift of gears, but it's I have a family member who recently lost a spouse of 24 years of marriage. And I can imagine this person that lost the spouse is grieving, and then also the person who is the family member of this person that is now left widowed. It says they seem to be the perfect couple. Her spouse was and has been deceased for over a year, but she still seems to be in the fog of grief. So my question is grief a mental disorder?
Wow, that's a really good question. And that's something that psychologists and mental health professionals and various others have debated back and forth. Just recently, interestingly enough, the diagnostic manual has come to the conclusion that grief under certain conditions can be a mental disorder. Now, so answer this question then is no and yes. And here's what I mean by that. Grief is a natural process, especially when you lose a loved one, especially a family member, especially a spouse, or especially a child. There is going to be this grief. Grief also happens after divorce. Grief sometimes happens after the loss of a job that you loved. Maybe you were fired. Maybe you let go. Maybe you retired. But grief is a natural process. Most people realize and have concluded that grief has several phases and stages. Denial sometimes is the first stage of grief. I can't believe this happened. I can't believe I'm going through this. I can't believe they walked away. I can't believe they passed away. And so there's this sense of denial. Once you have realized that, yes, this has happened and you can no longer, quote unquote, deny it, you become angry. Sometimes you become angry with yourself or angry with God or angry with the physician that did not provide the care that you thought they should have provided, or angry with the person who died in some cases. And so the point is that anger becomes a part of that grieving process. A third stage is bargaining. What could I have done to have kept them from walking away? What could I have done to have kept them from passing away? What could I have done? Maybe I could have prayed more. Maybe I should pray more, or whatever it may be. And so this bargaining phase of grief kicks in. And then when you realize that the bargaining is not going to work, then depression. Now, the thing is that grief cycles. You'll cycle back around to denial and then to anger and to bargaining and then to depression. And sometimes you'll cycle those four feelings or emotions in the course of an hour or the course of a day or a week. Eventually, you'll get to the place of acceptance. This has happened. And then you get to a place of closure. Now, that's a natural process of grief. However, when grief goes beyond that, when grief creates certain symptoms, then that's when the diagnostic manual says then grief can become a mental disorder. And so what are some of those symptoms? Number one, when the death has occurred more than 12 months. In other words, the death has happened over a year, and the person is no better a year later than they were the day it happened, for example. So in other words, the grief is still as fresh, still as powerful, still as painful. Number two, of course, naturally, if you're close to that person, if it was a child, a parent, a spouse, a sibling. Thirdly, when you're preoccupied with the memories to the point to where these memories are so powerful that they are debilitating, meaning I have a hard time getting dressed. I have a hard time leaving the house. I have a hard time doing the natural functions of life. In other words, when you're impaired socially, when you're impaired occupationally, I cannot go back to work. I cannot do the tasks that I once did because the grief is so overwhelming. When your identity is disrupted. In other words, I don't know who I am anymore. I was, my spouse's best friend, or I saw myself, I was her husband, I was his wife, or whatever. That was my identity. And now that they're gone, I have no identity. Another is when the emotional pain is so intense that it feels as if it's just overwhelming. I just cannot handle this pain. Another is difficulty having other relationships. So many times I have had siblings come to me and say, yes, we lost, our brother, our sister, and my mom and my dad are grieving, but they're grieving to the point to where they have left us out. And they're no longer looking to us, or they no longer consider us, or they no longer embrace us. So when there is a difficulty having other relationships or activities, when there's an emotional numbness that the person just doesn't feel anything, and when there's that intense loneliness. So when your grief gets into that arena, then that is when grief can now become or be considered a mental disorder.
So grief is a huge topic.
Sure.
Everyone on the planet experiences grief, like you said, in one way or another.
Oh, yeah.
And usually it's more intense when it is someone that we love, someone that's close to us. This question, when it's a spouse of 24 years.
Right.
So a couple of things that you mentioned with grief, and I think hopefully maybe you can clarify. You talked about the stages and phases of grief. I think a lot of times people have been taught that it's almost a staircase, that each stage or phase of grief is just the next step,
Right.
and
Right.
you're supposed to progress through those in a
Right.
nice, orderly, clean line to reach the top, which is acceptance and closure.
Correct.
So can you kind of shed some light on that?
Yeah, I have seen the model of the quote-unquote staircase. I will argue that it's more of a cycle. That you're cycling through these stages. That some days you'll wake up and the person will say, maybe this is just a bad dream, and maybe the person, I'm going to walk into the living room, they'll be sitting in their chair like always or something. Well, that's a sense of denial. Sometimes a person will wake up and they'll hear something or see something that will remind them of what has happened, and they go into this rage or anger as to, again, what they experienced. Some will spend a lot of time bargaining. Maybe if I pray more, pray harder, maybe if I, woulda, coulda, shoulda done something different. And so they're in that bargain, and some stay in that depressive state. So I will argue it's more of a cycle. Not only that when that cycle is moving, but when you get stuck in one of these areas, when you get stuck in denial or stuck in anger or stuck in bargaining or stuck in depression, that is when I will argue grief can become even more dangerous. We've all met people that the loved one has passed away, but they are in denial. And they'll say things like, I know he's coming home. I know she's coming home. I know they'll be back. And everyone said, no, wait, we had their funeral. You were there. No, he's going to come back. Or whatever. Or they stay angry. They're angry at the world. They hate hospitals. They hate churches. They're just angry with everybody. Or they're constantly bargaining, constantly struggling with what could I have done? What should I have done? They get caught up in what I call the magical thinking, which we can talk about later. Or they're in depression. So getting stuck in one of those is when it becomes problematic. As long as you're cycling, as long as you're working through the grief per se, then things begin to eventually get better. That's when you eventually land in that acceptance or closure.
So when I watch a movie, which never fails, lost my dad several years back in August, and it seems like we always watch movies and pick random movies that, it's about the father dying. And so when I cry, because my heart still breaks and I still have that connection, that's not an unhealthy thing. But if I were to be stuck in a cycle where it was debilitating, then what you're saying is those are the times that it's unhealthy.
Right. And the reality is that some people will argue that, yes, we can reach, acceptance, and yes, we can reach even closure. But there will still be those moments, as you mentioned, where you have that memory, you have that song that you hear, you have that movie that you see, you have that moment where, golly, I remember that, and that moment of sadness, I will argue, more than grief, but that moment of sadness begins to be a reality in your life, which is perfectly fine. I mean, we're emotional creatures. God made us, wired us to have, to enjoy happiness and to, manage through sadness. And so that's not unhealthy.
So if someone's wondering, am I in a natural cycle of grief, or am I in an unhealthy, now my grief has brought me into a mental disorder and I need to get help? How's the best way for them to evaluate that, and how can they get help?
Right. Ask the question, and maybe ask those closest to you if you can, is this grief keeping me from living the basics of life? And if the grief is overwhelming and debilitating and keeping you from doing the basic things of life, getting up, going to work, paying your bills, cutting your grass, etc. If the grief is so great that it is that debilitating, that is when you may need to call a therapist, call a counselor, maybe call your physician, maybe get involved in some sort of grief recovery work with a group. All of these things are very helpful. All of these things are very important. All of these things, I think, can help a person work through the grief process so that they can live out the life that their loved one, I'm quite confident, would want them to live out. And that's very important to understand and note.
So what is your phone number for your private practice if somebody knows?
You can reach us at area code 225-936-2607, and we'll do our very best to help any way we can.
Well, thank you so much. The doctor is in the house, the family answer man. We want to thank all of you for joining us. Again, we want to thank the incredible people at Winter's Air and Days Smokehouse and Specialty Meats for underwriting today's show. And as a reminder, this is not a therapy session, and this advice is general and not specific to your situation. So if you would like to seek help or have more questions that you want answered in a specific way, you can always get in touch with Dr. Mark at his private practice, through your counselor, as he said, through your doctor, and to seek that health. We want to be here for you to answer questions, to encourage you, to inspire you to make changes that lead to a stronger, healthier, and happier family. If you have questions that you would like the Family Answer Man to answer, you can email familyanswerman@loumc.org or soundradioinfo@milldale.org. And again, thank you for joining us today on the Family Answer Man.